So, what are some relationship killers? Find out on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Today, we're going to be discussing relationship killers, and there's 4 particular things that we are going to talk about. Sometimes these are called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for relationships. Which sounds very ominous, but bear with us here. So Liz is, for anyone who may not know, Liz is she's a registered psychotherapist in the qualifying stage of her license right now, and she works as a therapist every day. And so what we'll do is I'll introduce each of these relationship killers, each of these 4, and define it, and we'll talk about it if that sounds agreeable, Liz.
Yep.
So the first one is criticism. So often criticism is a complaint or an episode of blaming, and usually this has global attacks on your partner's personality or character. So criticisms might begin with words like "you always" or "you never," or they might add at the end, "what is wrong with you?" And they're often complaint specific. So Liz, can you take us through this? What have you seen in your clinical practice?
So I find that if someone's making a complaint, it's usually something like, "I'm frustrated that you forgot to take out the trash." So that's perfectly fine. That's kind of more the goal of the direction we want to move people in. But if someone's saying, "You're such an idiot, why can't you remember to take out the trash?" There's an attack, you're labeling them as an idiot, and there's, an accusation that there's something wrong with the person because they can't remember to do it, when reality is this is something that people commonly forget to do, and you have to problem solve in a different way and approach it in a different way if you want to get a positive response instead of getting into an argument.
Well, rhetorical questions, especially negative rhetorical questions, aren't a good way to have a dialogue. Nobody is going to actually answer the question, "What is wrong with you?"
Well, if they do, they're going to answer it in a defensive way, and then that tends to lead to an argument, which doesn't resolve the problem, and it doesn't feel good for anyone involved.
Well, and I hope this doesn't take us off kilter too much, but I've spoken to friends who have gone through issues in relationships with their family, and it's also a problem of identifying what the issue is. So complaints are issue specific, but they may not be specific to the real issue. So like if you snap at your partner for leaving a dirty plate on the counter without rinsing it, the root of the anger may not actually be in the fact that they left a plate on the counter. Maybe they don't do that usually.
Yeah, I mean, these things can get very complex quickly. You think, oh, it's just a plate, but it could actually be rooted in, the person's feeling overwhelmed, or it reminds them of something from their past that might be a trigger for insecurity, or, feeling neglected, or so many other things. So there can be so much more going on than just what we see on the surface.
All right, so let's move on to the second one. The second is defensiveness. So being defensive involves counterattacks to defend our innocence or avoid taking responsibility for a problem. So defensiveness often takes the form of cross-complaining or whining, like, "Oh, I help you with your computer all the time, but you don't seem to value that." Or when if just going back to our previous example of you didn't take out the garbage, well, the other partner might say, "Well, you didn't do the dishes." So it's kind of a way to shift the responsibility or onus off of you and on back onto the other person. So
yeah. And I mean, if you're at a stage of life where you're just both really exhausted, I'm thinking of a couple that's got some young kids in the house. They're probably really run down and just both tired, both have a lot on their plate, and things get missed. And so it's very easy to get into, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And questioning the other person's integrity and not ever getting actually to resolving the issues.
Well, and also it can be really complex. I mean, when you're dealing with more than one issue at a time. So if, like, both the dishes and the garbage might be legitimate issues to bring up, fair issues to bring up in a relationship, but maybe deal with them separately.
I think as well, one way to reduce the likeliness of your partner responding defensively is to acknowledge something that they've done that you appreciate before you bring up your concern about something that was left undone. As well, mentioning it instead of saying, why didn't you do this? Say, hey, when can you get to this? Can you get to this by the end of the day or something like that? So it's not an immediate demand on the person as well, can be quite helpful. So that'll shift it more away from getting a defensive response.
Well, when I was in graduate school, we oftentimes had to do peer critiques. So we would read a paper that another person in my class wrote, and we would have to critique them on how they applied the theory or how they met the criteria. And your grade came on how effectively you critiqued the other person. But I had one professor particularly say, you're not allowed to just point out negatives. You should have 3 compliments for every criticism. And it was a way to sort of soften feedback and help it be more constructive, because if the paper you gave back was only the bad things, then that might really discourage the person. And grad school is hard enough without having other people discourage you.
Well, I mean, there's some people who have the philosophy that if everything's good, they don't have to say anything and they only bring it up when there's an issue. And so that can be really discouraging and depleting, because if you're only getting negative feedback, then you don't have that positive information and appreciation for what you've done well, and then you're less motivated to continue to do those things you do well.
So the third one, moving on, is contempt. So contempt is very similar to criticism, which we mentioned before, but contempt is actually bolstered by hostility or disgust. So, for example, if someone is trying to if somebody's trying to tell you something important about themselves and you roll their eyes, that is expressing contempt. Contempt oftentimes involves sarcasm, mocking, or name calling, belligerence. Statements like, "Do you really think making a list is going to help you remember what to get at the store? Because you forget everything." It's statements like this. Have you seen this in your clinical practice?
Well, I think when things get to the point of contempt, then that's one of the ones that's really going to break down a relationship quickly, because no one wants to be treated with contempt, especially if it's a voluntary relationship you're in. You don't want to be treated badly. You want to be treated with appreciation instead of contempt. So if you value the relationship you're in, then you really need to make effort to show that appreciation, and seek a therapist if you're dealing with feelings of contempt or resentment, because relationships aren't perfect and it's very natural to feel some resentment. But if you address it quickly, then it doesn't build up. And when it builds up over a long time and isn't addressed, then it can be really hard to work through.
Well, and that actually segues nicely into the fourth and final horseman of the apocalypse for relationships, which is stonewalling, which happens when one partner will withdraw from the conversation and offering no physical or verbal cues that they're impacted by what they hear. So it's like talking to a rock. There's no it's a complete poker face, and they're just running away. They're just avoiding. And so that's where we get into some areas, obviously, where the issues have, as you said, built up and really culminated to a point of it being very serious.
Yeah, and part of this can also be someone's ability to tolerate conflict. There's some people, they need to take a break and take time to think about it. So it's more so a problem of stonewalling if it's going on for days and days where the person won't even talk or acknowledge when you enter the room. It's perfectly fine, on the other hand, if someone's just like, they need like a 30-minute break before they can continue a conversation. So those are two different things. So if you find that your partner tends to stonewall, at a time when they're calm, talk to them about, how can we handle things if it becomes too difficult? What can we do to help you work through those difficult emotions so that we can come back to the conversation?
And obviously, these are issues that will happen in relationships at given times. So the appearance of one or any of these issues in and of themselves is not an indicator that your relationship is doomed, but maybe it's an indicator to seek help. Like, is there any recommendations you would have, Liz, for anybody who has seen one or more of these four relationship killers in their relationships?
I'd say get help from a couples therapist as soon as you can, because it's much easier to deal with these things at the beginning when they're smaller issues than if it's been 10 or 15 or 20 years. It's going to be much harder to work through any resentment that's built up, and then it's a much longer process.
Well said. And our next episode will actually be on relationship builders. So there is hope out there, but that's all the time we have for today. But if you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing, sharing, and liking. We really appreciate all the feedback and support that we've been getting from everyone. And until next time, remember that small steps lead to big changes. We'll see you next time.